All right. So first of all, hi everybody. Um, you're gonna see that I stole these slides. So in the spirit of don't ever recreate a PowerPoint presentation from on a topic when somebody just did a really good one, just make sure you give them credit. So this was presented at the ACEP Leadership and Advocacy Conference this past week by Ryan McBride and Fred Esses and Erin Grossman. And Ryan and Fred are our two lobbyists, and Erin is our Director of Regulatory Affairs. So they did this little three-part panel, and I've adapted it a little bit. I've put in a few other slides. But they did a really nice job of trying to, and I was talking to Lexington before some of you joined. They did a really nice job. We did some fundamentals at this past LAC. You know, there are times when we get into some deep, weedy, nerdy, tangential stuff. And the consensus of the planning committee for this year was, why don't we do some basic stuff? Because we never really know who really understands the basics of how this whole sausage making works. So in that spirit, Ryan, Fred, and Erin did this nice job, and I thought I would take it and I've adapted it a little bit. But that's kind of the gist here. And you know, these days in particular, although Ryan, Fred, and Erin focused on the legislative and regulatory world, just again to level set that, you know, not just in the United States Constitution, but in every branch of government, whether you're at the federal level, the state level, or particularly, you know, even at the county level, there is usually a legislative and executive and a judicial, you know, component. And part of that is, so part of this is you got to know where your issue lives. And the cheeky example I'll use is, you know, if the street light is out in front of your house and you call the White House to complain, two things will happen. One, your street light's not going to get fixed. And two, the Secret Service will probably come and knock on your door, right? Because they'll think that you're crazy if you're calling the White House to get your street light fixed. So you got to make sure you know where your issue lives, at what level. And then you can decide, okay, is this a legislative issue? Is this an administrative or executive issue covered by regulations? Or is this a legal issue that belongs in the courts? So just to kind of remind us about where things live. And, you know, for those of you who are Jeopardy fans, you know, I'll take people who are making decisions about my future for $1,000. And this is obviously at the federal level, focusing on healthcare stuff, right? So I'm going to presume you all know who all these people are. And if you don't, you should. But obviously, President, Secretary Kennedy, now CMS Administrator, Dr. Oz, and then Senator Schumer, who's the Senate Minority Leader for the Democrats, Senator Thune to his right, who is the Senate Majority Leader now for the Republicans from South Dakota. On the bottom left is Hakeem Jeffries, who's the House Minority Leader for the Democrats, and then the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson from Louisiana. So part of this message is you got to know who these people are. And you got to do some homework sometimes to make sure that you understand where they're coming from. And if you're going to go meet with a legislator, you know, I would recommend, we all do this, you have to do the appropriate level of stalking ahead of time. And I'll tell you a story. I don't know if I told this story last time. Lexington, did I tell a story about the call that I was on where I didn't do my pre-stalking, and in fact we had a funny coincidence. Maybe I didn't tell the story
Yeah, I don't
about the
remember.
license plate. No. So,
No.
all right. So here's a great example of why you should pre-stalk. So we had heard that one of the committees that we're going to talk about, the Ways and Means Committee, that they were looking to make some changes to the physician fee schedule. And we didn't really know where they were headed. They asked about a particular component of the fee schedule called practice expense. And we were like, huh, we ought to talk to them about that. So one of the lobbyists arranged a call, and we got on this Zoom, and the person from the Ways and Means Committee, I'll just say Joe, said, "Hey, I apologize. My camera is not working, but I'm on, so I can't be on camera." And we were like, "Okay." And then I realized I hadn't really looked at him beforehand. And one of the other people started to talk. And so I quickly went on LinkedIn. And the first thing that I noticed is that this staff director for Ways and Means Committee was connected to my son on LinkedIn. And you're like, huh? And so you quickly scroll down, and I realized that the staff director had graduated from the University of Rhode Island the year after my son did. We live in Rhode Island. And I'm like, oh, he probably knows Connor from class or something like that. And so I let him keep talking. And then when it was my turn, I said to him, I said, "Hey, Joe, look, I'm sorry you don't have your camera doesn't work because," and I'll show you all. Um, right behind me on my shelf is this license plate that says Rhodey. And so I said, "Well, it's too bad you can't see the license plate." And there was silence, and I could tell he was thinking. And he said, is your son friends with Alex Peralt?" And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "The Peralts live down the street from you, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "I've been to your house." And you're like, yeah, you're like, what's the chance of that? And I will say it, my son is now 30. This was last year, and the staff director just about the same age. And I'm going to say it. He said it in a way only a 20-something could have said, "I've been to your house," without saying that we've been drinking at your house, but saying that we've been drinking at your house. He just kind of said, "Yeah, I think I've been to your house," and that kind of like, oh my God, I hope he doesn't know that we were, what we really did. So whenever you go to talk to one of these people, make sure that you go and pre-stalk them and find a nexus, find something that you have in common with them, whether it's a school that you went to, whether it's your religious preference, whether it's some place that they worked before, but do your best to find a nexus because that becomes a real icebreaker in a conversation. And this is true for just any relationship, right? Any conversation that you have. The minute that you have a connection to someone, it totally changes the tenor of the conversation. And after that 30-second exchange, I can tell you there was no way they were going to make a change to the physician fee schedule after that conversation. Because after that, first of all, I think he really didn't need, I think he wanted to hang up at that point. But at that point, as we talked about that, the minute you feel like you are connected to someone, it's much harder to do something that's going to be a negative for on that person, right? So find that connection, make that connection. And so there are people every day right now in Washington making decisions about healthcare. And why won't my slides advance? Okay. And then there's this guy, right? Because look, I'm used to how the sausage has been made. I've been doing this advocacy thing for a long time. This is a whole nother level of unpredictable chaos. And uh, you got to just shrug and you go, well, we'll see how this plays out. And part of that is when you are considering, how am I going to influence these policymakers? This kind of unpredictability makes it really hard, right? And because you just don't know how much authority he's really going to be given, there seems to be some pushback at times. And this administration, and I'll say specifically this president, you can watch his negotiate like he's negotiating like he's on like he's in the art of the deal, right? We make a crazy, ridiculous statement because that's where we're going to start the negotiation. Like Canada's going to be the 51st state, right? And you're like, what are we doing here? But and at some point you got to decide, do we believe President Trump is crazy or crazy like a fox? And on any given day, I'm not really sure. But there are times when I go, oh, this was totally a setup. This was totally part of the strategy of we're gonna make statements that just seem so absurd that everybody kind of loses their mind. And in the meantime, he's already got the next four levels already planned out. So think about, just in terms of not reacting to everything at the same level. Take everything with a grain of salt, take a deep breath after every statement, because 90% of the time, I don't think that's really what their policy is going to be, but they are really starting at the extremes and then working their way down. And just in that spirit, I was talking with Lexington. Look, there's been more executive orders than most of us can keep track of. The reality is executive orders have the weight of law unless the courts say they don't. Right? So yes, the president has always used executive order. Every president has used executive orders. Certainly President Biden used executive orders quite a bit and pushed policy pretty far at times, right? And I know this is probably a sore spot for all of you, but he pushed the issue of student loan repayment clearly beyond legislative intent. And at some point, the courts are like, yeah, that's not what the programs were ever enacted to be. So just keep in mind there are three levels of federal courts. You'll hear a lot about district court decisions. District courts, there are 94 of them. So, and district courts tend to be, depending upon where they are, you can kind of tell what flavor of they are, whether they're conservative or liberal, just based on where they are. And oftentimes, plaintiffs will do venue shopping. They will go to a U.S. district court. As long as they have any kind of nexus there, they will go to a district court where they believe the individual justices are more conservative or liberal. In a district court decision, it is one justice, one judge issues the opinion. And the question is so how far does that reach? And this is actually one of the things that I think the Supreme Court is going to decide is, can a district court create an injunction, stop something from happening across the country, or is a district court limited to stopping something only within their district? Typically, district courts, their rulings only have standing and have authority within their district. And so we've seen some district courts issue injunctions in the last, month or so that basically say, well, the program has to stop nationally. And people are going, that's not the way that usually works. So if a district court decision gets appealed, it gets appealed to one of the 12 circuit courts. And when a case is brought to a circuit court, just so you know, there are 3 justices assigned to the court. And these courts tend to be sometimes kind of liberal or conservative leaning, but they are much more balanced. And similarly, a court of appeals, a circuit court, the question is how far does that ruling go? Because there are 13 geographic circuits, and the same question is going to arise about, can a circuit court stop something across the country or just within their circuit? And then obviously the last stop on the judicial train is the Supreme Court. And once the Supreme Court renders a decision, that is really final. That is the interpretation of the law. And at that point, people got to follow it. Now, interestingly, last time I checked, there are no Supreme Court police. So one of the interesting things about the Supreme Court is they have the authority to make a decision. Somebody's got to enforce that decision. So one of the kind of interesting things about the Supreme Court is we for the most part, people kind of play along with, okay, the Supreme Court said, but I'm not sure that at sometimes we won't see that get pushed back. All right, and I was talking to Lexington about this. Okay, so here's the deal. There are going to be times when you are going to interact with a policymaker with whom you do not agree on everything. Okay? I've been in this again doing advocacy for 30 years. I've never, ever met a member of Congress or a legislator, an elected official, or an appointed official for that matter, that I agreed with everything that they believed. So part of the interesting part of this advocacy game is, what do you do when you don't agree with them on some stuff, but they really want to help you on other stuff? And so back in March, I had the opportunity, I was one of the first 4 physicians to go and meet with Secretary Kennedy. And we were invited to talk about one specific thing, the No Surprises Act, which is a law that was passed 5 years ago about what happens when a patient is seen and they're seen by a provider who's not in their commercial insurance network. And it's wicked complicated. I could talk about this for, I don't know, ever. But we got invited to go talk to the secretary about that. And we're like, okay. So we go in and we talk, and we have a great conversation. A 45-minute meeting with the secretary talking about this one issue. And at the end of the meeting, he basically turned to his staff, and the meeting was not just with the secretary, it was with his chief of staff, the two deputy secretaries for policy, the brand new administrator of Cirillo, which is the part of HHS that deals with commercial insurance, his general counsel, and a couple of other folks. So this was like all the peeps are in the room. And at the end of the meeting, he turned to them and said, "We have to fix this." And we were thrilled, right? So at that point, we go, let's stop talking because we've got them. And then we go, let's take pictures and selfies. And so interestingly, I posted that picture. I sent it to a number of friends, and maybe you would be interested, maybe you'd be surprised, maybe not. Half of them said, "That's awesome, that's amazing." And the other half, "Well, did you check your morals at the door? How could you possibly go and smile in a picture with this man?" And that was a really that was eye-opening for me. But along the way, at some point, you're going to make a decision about, how much do I agree with somebody versus how much do I disagree with them? What topics are those on? But I have to tell you, you have to get comfortable with, I'm going to go talk to people that I disagree with them vehemently on some topics, but they are my BFF on other stuff. And how do you reconcile that is really just an ongoing challenge. And I will say 2 things. One is, if the secretary mentioned the word vaccine at any time during that meeting, I was going to fake a seizure, because there was no way I was going to talk about vaccines with him. I'm not an expert on vaccines, and I certainly was not going to try and have that conversation on the fly. The other thing is, I vehemently disagree with him about one other thing, which is, I love Fruit Loops, and I'll be damned if he's going to take my Fruit Loops away. So honest, you can check my Amazon. I am now stockpiling Fruit Loops because I am going to have Fruit Loops, just so you know. And I may retire by making up little dime bags of Fruit Loops and selling them to people who are desperate at some point. Just saying, I might do that. All right. So let's get to talk about the structure of the federal government. Think about legislative committees. We'll talk about House and Senate. And then there are federal agencies that execute and carry out laws. So Congress makes laws, the executive branch executes the laws, and the courts are there to make sure that they both stay within their respective bounds, right? In the House, there are 2 major committees related to healthcare, okay? The Energy and Commerce Committee, otherwise known as ENC, and Ways and Means. In the Senate, it's much clearer, and I'm going to go through, and again, these are great slides that those folks put together. You go, well, what lives in Energy and Commerce? What lives in Ways and Means? It's a little fuzzy sometimes, even for me. In the Senate, it's much clearer. In the Senate, everything that's health policy lives in the HELP committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And everything that's about funding healthcare is in the Finance Committee. Now, there are some other committees that are important in this process, like Appropriations, and that basically is the committee that decides exactly how much money is going to get allocated to each of these programs. So there are programs, there's 2 parts to getting anything done in the real world in this country in terms of a program. The first part is the program has to be authorized That means one of the policy committees has to say, we want this to be something that the federal government does. The second part of the process is the appropriations process, which says we are putting in the budget X amount of dollars to carry out that policy. So for example, 5 years ago, we got the Dr. Lorna Breen Act passed. You had to get it authorized first, and then it got appropriated for, I think, $10 million or something like that. When a program is authorized, it can be authorized on an ongoing basis, or it can be authorized for a period of time. So the Lorna Breen Act was authorized for 5 years. So here we are now, 2025, and we've got to get the Lorna Breen Act reauthorized. So it has to go back to the policy committees, and they've got to vote again to say, we want to continue this program as part of the work of the federal government. It then has to go back to appropriations again to get money. So authorization and appropriations are the two-step process of actually getting something to do something. In the House, the House and Senate work a little differently. In the House, a bill can be assigned to multiple committees. So you may find that a bill is assigned primarily to the Energy and Commerce Committee, but it can be assigned also to the Judiciary Committee, to the Appropriations Committee. So in the House, there can be multiple committees called the Primary Committee and other relevant committees. In the Senate, there's just a primary committee. They don't do this multiple committee thing for policy. They give it to one committee, and that committee is the Committee of Jurisdiction. In the House, the other thing that's a little more complicated is, well, who can be on these committees? And House members, as well as Senate members, can be on multiple committees, except if you are appointed to one of those committees, Appropriations, Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, or Financial Services, you cannot serve on another committee in the House. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing or challenging, because let's say I'm from Iowa and I really want to be on the Agriculture Committee. That's great. You can be on the Agriculture Committee. However, at some point, as you move up in seniority and authority, Agriculture Committee is cool if you're an Aggie, get it. But the Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means and Appropriations, that's where the power is. So at some point, if you want to move to be on appropriations, you've got to give up your seat on the Ag Committee. So the House has these specific exclusive committees. And in the Senate, the A committees, and this is typical of the make-up dopey words. So the A committees, like the A list, are Help, Finance, and Commerce, and then they have, and a lot of other ones, and then they have the Super A committees, which are better than the A list committees, which is just goofy titling. So in the Senate, Appropriations, Armed Services, Finance, and are the kind of exclusives, and then Foreign Relations, but only for the Republicans, because both parties make their own rules. In a committee, generally the makeup of the committee in terms of the size is really up to the chair. But usually the chair and the ranking member. So the chair is in the majority party, and the ranking member is the most senior person in the party that is in the minority in that chamber, whether it's the House or the Senate. So let's suppose that there was right now in the House, there are 433 members because 2 Democrats have passed away and they have not been replaced. And the Republicans have 219 of the 433. So the committees are pretty closely split in terms of the House is pretty closely split. So most of the committees right now have, like, the Republicans have 1 or 2 extra seats compared to the Democrats. In the 117th Congress, which was now 4 years ago, the Senate actually was split 50-50. And but whoever has the White House at that point would be the deciding vote, because the vice president is the deciding vote in the case of a tie in the Senate. Again, assignments in committees are generally based on seniority. There is a process in both the House and the Senate, more in the House than in the Senate, that basically members try to get support from their colleagues to get on committees like Energy and Commerce, and particularly to get support to be vice chair or chair of a subcommittee. Um, Look, every member of Congress is human, and they all, for the most part, want to have some power, right? They want to be able to have power in their committees and power within the caucus because that allows them to get more stuff for their district, to be honest. And look, some of them think they want to be speaker someday, so they are constantly trying to work to do that. Ways and Means right now, the chairman is Jason Smith from Missouri, and the ranking member is Richie Neal from Massachusetts. Um, this is the oldest committee in the House, and they have the authority to write tax law. So in particular now, with this concept called reconciliation, the Ways and Means Committee will be very important because they will be writing the rules about extending the Trump tax cut and whatever changes they want to make to that. They also oversee Social Security, Medicare, and for us, things like the No Surprises Act about out-of-network balance billing, Medicare payments, that all lives within Ways and Means. So they are very influential in terms of healthcare and healthcare delivery. They also are responsible for things like prior authorization. And then depending upon who the chair is, and Chairman Smith is from a pretty rural part of Missouri. So I think he still lives on the farm he grew up on. Things like rural health the chair can pick what they really want to focus on. And you'll hear more about that over time. In the Senate Finance Committee is probably the committee. The Help Committee is very important to us, but the Finance Committee, that Senator Crapo from Idaho, and Senator Wyden from Oregon, they actually are two pretty rational, thoughtful people, and they've been chair and ranking member back and forth, I think, for God, the last 12 years. And they really do work on a very bipartisan basis. Yes, they have some differing thoughts about policy based upon being a little more conservative versus liberal, but they have worked very well together. And their jurisdiction is about all parts of Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. So Senate Finance Committee makes the decision together with the House Ways and Means Committee about how much are we going to spend on Medicare in any given year. So those two committees, House Ways and Means, Senate Finance, are really the folks who are deciding what we're going to do with funding healthcare. And the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the chair now is Brett Guthrie from Kentucky. Ranking member is Frank Pallone from New Jersey, who hates physicians, hates. And I think the only person who hates physicians more than Frank Pallone is his chief of staff, Tiffany, who none of us ever want to talk to because she's mean and nasty and hates us, just so you know. So if somebody says you want to go meet with Tiffany from the Energy and Commerce Committee, just be ready to fake a seizure because it's not going to go well, just saying. And Energy and Commerce has many, many things within. Think about the concept energy and commerce, everything that's technology, everything that's environment, everything that's food and drug, everything that's internet and tech. Energy and Commerce has a really wide jurisdiction on a lot of stuff, policy-wise, absent the funding of healthcare like Medicare, and they have a pretty broad jurisdiction. So we talk with those folks all the time. Healthcare workforce, mental health, Medicare, Medicaid, all of the policy stuff. All of the policy stuff about healthcare lives in Energy and Commerce. The financing lives predominantly in Ways and Means. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. And honestly, with the No Surprises Act, we used the committees against each other because at that time, Frank Pallone was chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and he wanted to pass a bill that would basically say if a provider was out of network with a commercial insurer, the commercial insurer could pay you 150% of Medicare, and that's it. There would be no way for you to get anything more than that. I will tell you, if you know anything about healthcare financing, there is not a single practice in this world, in this country, that could operate on 150% of Medicare and stay open. All right. Medicare Medicare used to about pay, particularly I'm talking now for emergency medicine. Medicare used to basically, we would break even on Medicare, putting a physician at the bedside of a patient. But we've taken a Medicare cut 4 years in a row. And so Medicare doesn't pay for us to take care of Medicare beneficiaries anymore. Medicaid, on average, pays about half of what it costs to put a physician at the bedside, and the uninsured, we collect essentially nothing. So the only way emergency medicine practices survive, whether you're in a big group like US Acute Care Solutions that I work for, or whether you're in a single site that you work, you have a contract with one local hospital, we survive because we get multiples of Medicare from commercial insurers. So you may read in the news, oh my God, those rich, greedy doctors wanted 300% of Medicare from a commercial insurer. Yeah, because for emergency medicine, we lose money on 3/4 of the people we take care of. The only way we survive is by getting money from commercial insurers. I can't tell you this is a true national statistic, but I'd bet a nickel on it. The 100% of people that we take care of in emergency medicine, we lose money on 75% of them. And that 25% that are commercially insured is where we make 50% of our money. So when we have legislation that would affect how much we could collect from those commercial insurers, if that law passed the way Frank Pallone wanted, we would all be out of business. Emergency medicine would have collapsed as a specialty. So that's why you go, geez, that was a long time ago. Why are we still talking about the No Surprises Act? Because it's still really, really important to making sure that we have a viable practice for you to be in someday. So in the Senate, the policy committee is the Health Committee. Bill Cassidy is a gastroenterologist, so that's Dr. Bill Cassidy, gastroenterologist. He was a hepatologist at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. And Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders. Like you got it, like Bernie's just Bernie. And I went to medical school in Vermont. I went to University of Vermont. And when I was in medical school, Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington, Vermont. And he was, now he declares himself like an independent. He was a card-carrying socialist. That's how he ran for election in Burlington, Vermont. I don't know if he's still carrying his card, but he's still a socialist. So, some different ideas about healthcare. And they cover everything when we talked about, remember, authorizing. So everything that's policy, everything about policy about healthcare, including all of those agencies that live within HHS. So the National Institutes of Health, CDC, Food and Drug Administration, HRSA, all of the policy stuff comes from the Senate Health Committee. Again, lots of stuff related to healthcare. And then there is this appropriations committee. And again, this is one of those important committees because in the House, you have Tom Cole from Oklahoma, who's the chair, and Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, who's the ranking member. And yes, that is the actual color of her hair. I do not know what color that officially is, but she has this amazing purplish blue hair. That's Rosa. That's just her thing. And then in the Senate, you have Susan Collins from Maine and Patty Murray from Washington. And those four, so when the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, when there's negotiations about how much we're going to put into the budget for each of those things that have been authorized, it is the House and Senate Appropriations Committee that have to kind of figure that out and come up with a number. So also very important people. In theory, there are, in theory, supposed to be 12 annual appropriations bills. You'll hear about the appropriations process. And in theory, there should be a defense appropriations bill. There should be a healthcare appropriations bill, really thematic in nature. Because of the hyper-partisanship in Congress, I couldn't tell you the last time they actually passed all 12 annual appropriation bills. And eventually what happens is they don't get all those bills passed, because in theory, what would happen is you would have 12 appropriation bills, and if you put them all together, you would have the annual federal budget. You'd go, oh, so we break up all the money spending into 12 buckets, and when we do those 12 things, we would have a final budget. Well, it's not happened in a while. And so what we end up with is getting close to the end of the federal fiscal year runs October 1st to September 30th. So all of this discussion about shutting down, are we going to shut down the federal government? If the Congress doesn't pass and the president doesn't sign a budget before October 1st, government has to shut down other than for essential services. Mostly what happens now is you get one of these, what's called a CR, a continuing resolution. And what a continuing resolution basically says is, look, we didn't do our work of coming up with 12 new budgets. So we'll just take last year's budget and we'll pass it. We'll say just continue to keep doing that. Now they can make changes to the actual budget and do a CR that has changes. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. But a lot of people complain because that's not really a thoughtful way to go line by line to every program and go, hey, is this program still accomplishing its mission? What's the ROI? What's the value? And so you'll hear members, particularly some of the more conservative Republicans in the House, going, we don't want to do this CR process. They want to sit there and have that discussion in committee about each program to go, should we be funding this or not? They really want to have that conversation. There are also in the House and Senate and Congress what are called caucuses. And think about caucuses are like clubs, right? So, and if you look at the list of caucuses, they're more like they just keep making them up as they go along. But you can have the left-handed doctors caucus, you can have the blue-eyed doctors, you can have whatever caucus you want. It's basically just a club, and many of the members will join these caucuses to show their support for a particular issue or a particular group of people. And in the House, now we have two caucuses with physicians. So for many, many, many years, we've had the GOP Doctors Caucus, which was led by the Republicans in the House, not just the physicians, although it says GOP Doctors Caucus, it's actually kind of never really been the right name, because they've had social workers and pharmacists and dentists and pretty much any healthcare professional was allowed to be part of the GOP Doctors Caucus if they were Republican. Now, I will say that the GOP Doctors Caucus on many, many, many occasions would reach across the aisle and invite the Democratic physicians or Democratic healthcare workers to come and participate in briefings and discuss policy about healthcare. So it sounds pretty exclusive, but in reality, it was a pretty open door policy. For the first time now, we have 6 Democratic physicians in Congress, and because they got to this threshold that they felt was big enough, they now created, just to confuse everybody, the Congressional Doctors Caucus. That's what they called it. They didn't call it the Democratic Doctors Caucus. They called it the Congressional Doctors Caucus. So I'm pretty sure they did that just to poke the Republicans in the eye a little bit, to be honest. But we now have, I think it's now 24. I think there are 24 healthcare people in the House. So that's a pretty sizable, right? That's 5%. It's not an insignificant number of healthcare professionals, and they will continue to do work, hopefully together. All right, so you have all these people in Congress and they pass laws. You go, well, then what happens? Because the laws got to be implemented. So now we get into what's called the regulatory process. And I won't get too far in the weeds, but basically laws get passed and then somebody's got to go, well, what does that really mean? What is going to really happen tomorrow? And then you write regulations, what are called implementing regulations, to basically say, so when the ACA, the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010, said we're going to expand coverage to, certain groups of people. Well, somebody had to go write all the rules so that the states knew exactly what that meant. When you create a healthcare exchange, well, what are the rules about that? So rulemaking is what is done by the agencies. The executive branch now has to carry out the law by implementing regulations. That process has multiple steps. It can be really confusing, but usually there's what's called an RFI. So a law is passed. the agency of jurisdiction will say, hey, look, we got to write a rule about this. Anybody interested, tell us what you think about how you think this should go. And then they will take that and do a notice of public rulemaking. So they'll put out a draft or a proposed rule. And depending upon the type of rule, there's a required 60-day or a 90-day comment period. People get to write in comments. And then the agency is supposed to, actually by law, the agency is required to read every word of every comment. How'd you like to have that job? Maria, your job is to read the 430,000 letters that came, but they're required to read every word. And then they issue a final rule. All right. The agency that we tend to care most about, right, is the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is how it was structured in 2023. And you can see the green boxes are positions. If you're going to head up the Indian Health Service, you are required to be confirmed by the Senate. So the green boxes require Senate confirmation. And this is how it looked in 2023. This is how it looks now. And this was as of April 4th. And what we know is that the secretary believed that there were too many silos, right? If you look here, there's a lot of individual boxes, a lot of operational divisions that really were operating independently. And the president and the secretary believed that there needed to be much tighter coordination. So you'll see there are many fewer independent boxes, and number of things have been pulled into one of these offices. So the Office of Strategy now has the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, AHRQ. So they really try to thematically bring things into smaller, fewer boxes on the chain of command. All of the legal stuff was all brought into one office. And so we'll see. I don't know that this is necessarily a good or bad thing. I mean, if you said that there's now an assistant secretary for enforcement and all of the legal stuff within HHS lives in one office, I would tell you, if you go back here and you go, every one of these individual silos had an office of general counsel, like you could get a sense of, boy, there's a lot of, I'm not really sure who's talking to who. Now, we'll see, because look, they still got to be able to execute the mission. But the org chart certainly has changed. There is an office of now the Administration for Healthy America, and we all know that MAHA is the theme under which the secretary is operating. Again, a lot of consolidation about things that used to be separate that now live within one particular administrative office or one office. We'll see. It has for us on the advocacy level, we're trying to figure out the org chart as well, because you're trying to figure out who's who's in power, who won in this reorganization and who didn't. And I'll just mention CMMI, the CMS Innovation Center, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. The concept of alternative payment models, again, the way we get paid as physicians is under something called the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, the PFS. And for years, people have talked about, well, wait a minute, if you pay, Carolina, $1,000 every colonoscopy, what's the incentive for Carolina not to do colonoscopies? None, right? You go, look, as long as somebody will, lie still long enough, I'll do their colonoscopy, right? And there is a sense of, look, there's certainly a medical ethical perspective of we shouldn't be if somebody came and said, Caroline, I'd like to have a colonoscopy every day, there'd be a kind of a medical ethical point where you'd go, that's probably not the appropriate thing. But there's enough people out there that you could probably fill your schedule with $1,000 colonoscopies every day if you really wanted to. And there are people who go, well, that's great, but is that really the most effective way to use healthcare dollars? And part of the challenge is that we're so ingrained in this fee-for-service model that anything we try to do that's different is really, really hard because you are basically mucking around with the financial stability of practices. And when you want them to innovate, but you want them to take risk, it's really hard to get folks to be comfortable. So you may hear more about APMs, alternative payment models coming out of CMMI, but it is this hope that we can find ways to incentivize healthcare that doesn't focus on just the number of times we do something. Really, really hard to make that transition. You're going to hear more. You'll hear about the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice. Those are two agencies that have the oversight of both the business and the providers in terms of things like consolidation, privatization, antitrust, monopolies in healthcare. Those are the two entities that oversee those. And let me skip. Yeah, I don't really want to go. I can go through the No Surprises Act with you, but that was really just their example of the work that it took, and that we are still in the process of trying to get that law implemented in the way that we believe it was written. So we actually started the negotiations on the No Surprises Act in 2017. It took us 3 years to get the law passed in a way that we were glad we felt was a fair compromise law. The Biden administration, very honestly, they did not like the law that got passed. They really wanted it to be that benchmark rate setting, and they did everything they could within the letter of the law to write regulations that hurt providers and helped insurers. And here we are now. We finally had a chance to meet with the secretary. That's what that meeting was about. Was meeting with the secretary to say, hey, the previous administration totally screwed providers on this. And that law that was signed, they've never really implemented it with regulations and rules the way it was intended. And you're hurting us and you're hurting providers. And please, please change the regulations to go back to the way it was supposed to be. So, long story about for emergency medicine, this is painful. We're not the people who want to manage Nani's blood pressure for 100 years. So knowing that we're still fighting this battle 8 years later on one piece of legislation, although it's critically important, is somewhat painful. So with that, I will stop and happy to answer questions, thoughts.
Yeah, wow. I already have a question. How did you learn all this? Like, where did it start?
I'm
Did you
old.
just
I've been doing it for 30 years. Like,
experience?
just be
So,
old. Yeah. Just
so
hang around
going
long enough.
into
It's
it,
yeah, osmosis.
yeah.
No, I mean, I cared about this very early on, and I was fortunate. And part of it is interest and passion, but part of it is luck. And I ended up doing my residency at UMass in Worcester, Massachusetts. Turns out that the chair of the department was on the national ACEP board at that time, and he took me under his wing and supported me as a first year resident going to ACEP, the national meeting, which that year was in Boston. And no other first years got to go to that meeting. It's typically only the third year residents. But he knew that I was interested and let me go to that meeting. And I met with the Emmer folks there. And the following year in 1992, I got elected to the Emmer board. And I've been interested in policy ever since. I then got lucky again because most emergency physician groups, most doctors don't get any of this. They are totally clueless. And that's why we get our ass handed to us on a daily basis because the insurers are doing this. They got an army of zombie lobbyists that are never stop and try to take every penny out of your pocket. That's what they do all day long. Um, I had a friend who was working for a group now 20 years ago, and he said, you got to come work for this group. I think they're really good. I think you'd really find a place here. And I said, look, I'm happy to talk to them, but I really want to do advocacy and I want there to be support for that. So I met with the CEO, the physician who was the founder of the group. And I said, look, I want to do advocacy and you got to support me. And they gave me at that time a 20% buy down of my clinical time to do advocacy. And fast forward to 2015, when this whole out-of-network balance billing things is really starting to get going in the States first. And And the consensus was from the leadership, we need somebody who's going to do this full time. And so my full-time job is the Director of Government Affairs for U.S. Acute Care Solutions. They pay me a full-time physician salary to do that. Now I still work some clinical stuff on the side, so I remember which end of the stethoscope goes in your ears. But for the most part, I think I'm the only physician in the country. I know I'm the only emergency physician in the country who has that, who've been able to do that. So I got lucky twice. But the goal is for all of you to be knowledgeable so that you can go to whatever group, you're at in residency, wherever you match, you're going to go talk to the chair and the PD and go, I want to do this advocacy stuff. I'm going to be part of EMRA. I want us to know more about this. I want our residents to learn about this because if we're ignorant, then we lose, right? So that's how I know this stuff. I do it all day long, every day. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's basically like
right.
medicine too.
How do you learn it? How are you
Yeah,
learning all your stuff?
doing it every
You
day.
work hard and you put time in and you read and you go to conferences and you talk to people and that's how you learn.
How,
Same as anything else.
how come you haven't gotten, I guess, involved in like the direct being a politician side of things?
Yeah, so I when we moved here to Rhode Island, our school committee was a disaster. We actually had a husband and wife who were both on the school committee who would physically fight at the school committee meetings because they were going through a nasty divorce. And I'm like, well, I'm not having my kids be. So I actually did serve on the school committee in town. In 2008, I ran for state representative and lost. And if you all are too young to remember, that was the year this guy Obama ran. The Democratic vote might have been pretty high. I ran as a Republican. Bad strategy for Tony. And then since then, Lexington, I actually like mentoring others, to be very honest. And Congressman Ruiz from California was working for our group when he decided to run, and I helped him, so to some degree, I helped him get elected. Currently in Pennsylvania, there's a doc named Arvind Venkat. Arvind worked for us as well and mentored him. And he's the first physician in the Pennsylvania legislature in 60 years. You think about that a minute. You go, well, who the hell was making all the healthcare policy? And the answer is the lawyers, which is why healthcare, right? So we not only we have to get people like you, all of you, to get very comfortable with this stuff so that you go, yeah, I'm not letting them make those decisions. I want to be part of that. So that's the goal. The goal is to have you all someday be in Congress and making really good laws. Or just be president and do by executive order. Be much easier.
Yeah, I'll just run for president. Yeah. But
All right.
thank
Well,
you
you all
so
have a
much.
great rest of your weekend.